excited that you're with us because it goes way back. It took a while to happen because Samir, I announced already 3 semesters ago when I started the Juxtaposition series. You're one of the very first people that I asked.
I take 5 years for one appointment.
Yeah, you take 5 years for one project. It's architecture's time. So anyways, so 3 semesters ago, I approached and said, yeah, I'm coming. I was very excited. And then for very unfortunate and tragic reasons, you were not able to come for your lecture because it was actually the wake of a collaborator and friend of yours, Virgil Abloh, and that very day that you were supposed to give the lecture. And now, 1.5 years later, you made it. You arrived from Amsterdam today. It's really a great effort that you put in here. He's here for you guys, all the way from Amsterdam. And yeah, Samir, how to introduce you? You work in many different fields. Your background is that of an architect. So you studied architecture in the Netherlands at TU Delft. Since now, I learned actually earlier today, since almost 8 years, you work at OMA or AMO. OMA is the office of Rem Koolhaas, maybe one of the most known architecture practices in the world. And AMO is the place where you go beyond architecture. So when it goes beyond what like the classical definition of architecture is when you kind of switch the letters and it becomes AMO. And in your role as director of AMO, you engage in many different projects that engage or are in discourse with many different disciplines, from architecture to design to urban planning to fashion to music, etc. One of the many large projects that you were also responsible with was the Countryside exhibition at the Guggenheim that you designed and curated with your team with Rem Koolhaas together. So it was the first time, well, the major exhibition that as architects and city planners, the perspective was changed from the city as the main topic to actually the country, the countryside. And you have designed many exhibition stores as well, but another, for me, really outstanding exhibition was the Figures of Speech that you designed with and for Virgil Abloh. That was kind of the first large show on his entire oeuvre. And you have also been involved in designing various of his kind of off-white stores. But this is just to mention a few. The spectrum is very wide. That ranges from research to design. That said, again, warm applause for Samir, please, all the way from Amsterdam.
Is my mic on?
Filipe, again, forget to give you a hint. But you're good. Okay. So,
is this on?
I think it should be on.
Hello? Hello? Yeah.
Yes, it's good. Yeah. Stage is yours. And thanks again.
Let me switch off the WhatsApp in the background. Yeah, thank you, Lukas, for that introduction, and thank you all for for being here. Well, I think I'll just dive right into it. I have quite some material to show you. Some parts will be very fast, some parts will be a bit slower. And I'll give you a bit of an overview of things that I've been working on in the past couple of years. And, you know, like to use Duchamp, I mean, like we have some projects that actually, you know, take 5 years or even more. Typically architecture takes 10 years. But in some cases, like, you're always working on 5 different projects a year. So I'll start with the architecture part. For a Korean client, a kind of luxury brand called Genesis, where we were asked to redesign their flagship store, or basically their flagship store or dealership. And the concept or the idea here was actually to get rid of all the clutter that you would typically have in car dealerships, where you have like plants and like furniture and coffee machines. And so we basically cleaned up everything, hid all the spaces where the conversations would happen, and kind of like highlighted the car under, you know, daylight instead of spotlights to show the cars the best. And this was, I think, a first. This was a fitting room for a car. So you would basically step in the car, see yourself before you drive out, which I thought was something that, you know, I've never seen at dealerships. But I thought it was strange because people actually tend to wear a car almost as if they were wearing their clothes, since it is an extension of your lifestyle or your attitude or who you are. Another project that I did not long after was this project with Virgil on a off-white store in Miami. And basically the first slide of the deck was actually like, is shopping still relevant? And can you translate what you do as an artist, in this case Virgil, to something more simplified as just retail? And isn't there something that we can actually explore where, you know, the architecture actually is a base for everything that you do, and actually gives you a form of, let's say, broadcasting, but also like a form of communication with your base, which is not only a fan base, but also either fashion, either from art world, either from music. So what we did is actually design a store that actually was very dynamic rather than static. So the facade, the front facade, would be something that you could actually push to the back and would change over time, change according to whatever kind of, let's say, program you have you organize there. And so this was basically the ground floor facade. We turned that into almost like a furniture piece that you would be able to push, but also like insert different pieces of furniture according to the type of activities. Let's say from DJing to, again, to a normal store to maybe an art exhibition. And actually keep the whole kind of store in the vibe of a fulfillment center, where you would use a very basic kind of material palette throughout the store, and then as the store would change, the facade would be pushed to the back, either opening up or closing up during the time for different type of events. So this was the final kind of dream, and this was reality. Another store we did together was the store in Paris, where I used the kind of idea of like the eclectic forms of architecture in Paris that you would find, from very classical to very modern, and actually clash those and combine those into one space where you would have like a sequence of different types of spaces. Sometimes almost like as a catwalk stage, sometimes as something more intimate, sometimes it would look as an alley behind the station, but all basically within this one space to again show the let's say, not only the multidisciplinarity, but also like the different attitudes or ideas behind the brand. This was the upper floor. And the idea also here was to actually design something or create something that actually would be as unstable as the street itself, so that you could actually host a TV show or host, in this case, a radio show, switch to an opening for Fashion Week, where the party basically spills out to the street, and basically you take over one of the most important streets in Paris. Another project, this one in Korea. This is for a big Korean brand for which we've been working on this project. Again, a store, multi-layers, where we have two programs, the store and the offices, that are basically glued against this long, nondescript kind of concrete bar, slightly shifted from each other, and actually within the landscape of Seoul stand out, because on one side there is actually no facade. Then the part of beyond architecture, as Lukas said, I'm leading AMO, which is basically, for me, it was always a kind of dream to do more than architecture, because as soon as I studied architecture, I felt that there were so many disciplines, creating a kind of crossover, that it would be a shame to only kind of express that into, let's say, architecture itself. So this is a kind of typical language of us architects, let's say. But what I quite early on in my studies found was this part of OMA that was known for its architecture, but a part of that office that was a bit more obscure in that sense. It was a mirror image of OMA, and it was working with different type of clients, but also it had a different output. It meant the output was actually started with the thinking, and it could be either a research project, it could be a kind of strategic project for a client, but it could also be something much more academic in terms of research. And that to me was something really interesting, because that I thought was actually binding all these different offices, but also like different parts of culture, global culture actually together. So this was not only a mirror image in terms of name, but this is also like a mirror to the office itself. And so we basically said that, while OMA is doing architecture, AMO applies architectural thinking, which means that you actually have more freedom in terms of engagement. So you end up sometimes working in politics, sometimes in culture, sometimes in branding, with a range of clients. And so one of the first projects that I worked on while still studying in Delft was this project for Europe, where our office was asked to kind of develop, what is the message of Europe? What's the identity of Europe, and how do people perceive Europe? And this is the way that most of us, I think, perceive Europe. This kind of homogeneous blue carpet, represented with a blue, very neutral star with the, blue flag with stars, very neutral, while actually reality is much more diverse and much more complex. And so the idea was actually to use this complexity and diversity as a form of their communication. So instead of actually representing a blue flag with yellow stars, these are all flags of Europe then, starting from Ireland all the way to Greece. And we worked on this kind of exhibition that in like a multiple, let's say, setting of rings, we, on the one hand, kind of explained Europe as a political entity and the history of the European Union. That was the outer ring, and the inner ring was actually the culture of Europe, basically a kind of longer history of how Europe became what it is. So, and these two would be, again, used as a juxtaposition where the culture would play in the foreground, and let's say everything that was politics was in the background. And so there was actually an answer in what we called then the kind of yes regime, that also culminated in this book called Content. But I'll switch to this a bit faster because I'll be running out of time in the end. The other project that actually defined AMO for a long time was Prada. What started out as a commission for a store became actually this collaboration over more than 20 years, where we have developed, let's say, what we call the image, but also like the aura of Prada. So that we started with a store in New York, but we started doing these kind of interventions in the fashion shows, designing the fashion shows, but also adding a kind of political and cultural layer to fashion. and even thought of a number of branding campaigns where, counterfeits were actually embraced rather than pushed out. And so, what started out as a very clear collaboration on the store became this kind of multitude of, technology, culture, but also innovations where we proposed, something, social media was not existing then, but we thought it would be interesting actually to create a kind of platform where culture could also be explored and broadcasted, while at the same time you could sell your bags and stuff on the website. And even we proposed Prada eBay, where you could actually resell the Prada goods. Unfortunately, these were never fully embraced, but as time passed, they saw that these were, there were a couple of good ideas here. This is the wired part. I'll skip that, and I'll jump to figures of speech. This was the collaboration with Virgil, where we met in Paris. I invited him to collaborate on a project in New York, and there he asked me whether I was interested in working with him on his show, which I of course said yes to, because there was this, I think, friendship, like a camaraderie, like as if we went to university together. We immediately had this kind of understanding of architecture, of AMO, that he was a big fan of, and and he had never done an exhibition before. So he asked, like, if I would do an exhibition, I would need someone to, let's say, curate it with me, but also design it. And so first time I presented the collaboration also to the office, the question was like, who is Virgil Abloh? Because this was like, he just got appointed as LV director. And I said, well, actually more important maybe is to ask, what is Virgil Abloh? And in that sense, the answer would be much bigger and much more interesting than only who is Virgil Abloh. Of course, he is an architect. He's American, but African origin. He's an immigrant, but he's also like a media phenomenon. He's able to, let's say, glue things together that no other brand, no other institute, no other artist actually was able to combine. So he could combine, let's say, the high culture of art with DJing, with connecting that to the skate culture. So there was something to unravel there. And the MCA proposed to do a kind of chronological order of his work, which I thought was a bit strange, because like you don't do a retrospect for someone who's still alive. That's one, and second of all, like. I thought the chronology was not the most interesting part, but actually this ability to move between different disciplines and to combine them and go from network to network and actually create networks almost by himself. So I proposed a kind of division into disciplines, into worlds almost, where on the left we would start with fashion, then music. Sorry, I have a mouse. Yeah. So here would be the introduction. There's the early days of Pyrex. Here we would have a fashion. Then you would move to music. We would have an intermezzo with his art. Then Black Gaze, that I introduced as a form of, this was basically before Black Lives Matters and the kind of social unrest. But I thought that the big elephant in the room was actually to not discuss his ethnicity, but also his position as being not trained as a fashion designer and entering fashion. So there was a lot of, let's say, items unspoken. So this we thought would be the ideal kind of way to, explore that, but maybe also like critique it. And then the last space was art and design. And so we spent a lot of times working in between, let's say, all the fashion shows at his atelier in Paris, at different models, and then finally in 19 we opened this exhibition at the MCA. And some of the artworks were, you know, a result from, let's say, just a conversation actually from the airport to the museum, where we would talk about, let's say, how billboards are actually, you know, great examples of canvases for art. And he referenced Baldassari for that, and then he took one of those billboards, used it inside the space, and sprayed the backside. We also used part of his fashion shows, like the Mirror Mirror background, where he again referenced his background in architecture, but in a much more loose and kind of like moldable way. His DJ sets were sometimes accompanied with this kind of slideshow of words, because in his opinion, and I thought that was a great idea, like, you know, words are much stronger than images. If you read something, everyone has a single or different kind of image looking at the words, rather than if I would show you an image. His collaboration with Kanye, but also like for Black Gaze, where we made kind of like life-size statues, almost as Roman statues of the models, you know, to show this kind of multi-ethnicity that was going on in his shows, almost like as a layer of, again, also of his critique, but also using this quote from Pretty Woman, where someone says to Julia Roberts in one of the scenes, "You're obviously in the wrong place." And this was something that he felt, of course, as an artist, as an architect. So his first LV campaign was a very direct and kind of form of critique to that fashion world. Of course, the full collection of Nikes, where, you know, in a way, I think that his way of working, I felt was coming together in this collaboration with Nike, where he presented prototypes, and I thought that was kind of a good representation of his work in itself, because you can think of whether he's a really good fashion designer, or whether he's a really good artist, or whether he's a really good designer, or even a good DJ. But what I thought was really interesting about his ability actually to work is to always work with prototypes. And the prototype was actually this, his kind of like Duchampian take maybe, but it was never finished. It was always, you know, to be completed, or it was in a state where you could almost like see its incompletion, and that incompletion was actually the beauty of it. So the IKEA products, I literally just like piled up into this pile of collaborations. And a final piece, the Newport sign, as a kind of critique to American society. We then worked on a book, because I thought it would be stronger not to, let's say, do a catalog where you highlight, let's say, every artwork. But he mentioned that he had basically, I think, like 7 or 8 laptops and 13 hard drives. And I said, well, that's your book, so let's download everything from that. Let's make a selection from all that work, and that's basically your body of work from 1985 until now. And so that was literally, you know, what we did. So basically all the stuff that he had produced, from sketches to drawings, in high school, also university. So it became almost like the perfect index of his work. In retrospect, actually, I think, you know, like this, you know, we never thought that this would be such an important thing, because now, for the first time, actually, all his work was collected in one book. I'll switch to another exhibition I worked on in Doha, on the history of modern architecture, where, you know, through a kind of investigation of, you know, this maybe is an example of how different ways we have of kind of like producing our work. So in some cases you have a client that tells you this is a brief and you'll figure that out. In some cases there is no brief, there's only a question. We need to have an exhibition about modern architecture in Doha for the opening of the National Museum. There's no archive, there's no record of what was going on here. There's nothing in one central place. So you basically start a kind of investigation where you know, through let's say a number of talks, a number of interviews, start to recollect or put together this kind of history. So that we've done for a couple of weeks actually, because we had 12 weeks in total to do the research, the design, and the execution. So this was a super intense kind of range of talks to everyone who was involved in actually, you know, what Doha looks like right now. And that initially then was translated to an exhibition where we used, let's say, a number of, let's say, kind of like lines on the floor that indicated periods from 1980, from 1971 to 1995, 1905 to 2000, but also from 1948 to 1970. And from every period, what we basically discovered was that Doha wasn't built as this kind of, you know, as a let's say a mirror image of Dubai, that what a lot of people think, like it's all about the glamour, it's all about this kind of shiny buildings. But what we've seen from, let's say, if you would go back to history, it had been kind of like building steadily on this kind of image of a nation that was slowly opening up to kind of a global world, where they would invite not just any architect to bring modern architecture, but actually, you know, Kenzo Tange to design the National Library, but other big names that would start to redefine, let's say, the bricks or the foundations of modern architecture, but also like a modern society in Doha. One thing that we used also like a lot was the archives of the oil companies, because not only Shell, but also like British Petroleum, were some of the companies that actually had the most kind of insights of what Qatar looked like in the early 50s, which is interesting because it like almost every movie starts with this kind of very Orientalist idea of like there was nothing there, only sand, and then we came and brought modern culture. We also found some like unexpected gems, like this this piece by Zaha Hadid that was in a private collection. This was her submission for the Museum of Islamic Art. And the show basically consisted of different layers. So we not only looked at the imagery or the production of architects, but we also looked at the production of, let's say, the urban planning offices. So the government, how was the government involved? And these were not only private commissions, but the government built on this vision of how to, you know, create this country. And last part will be about the countryside, which was the kind of the project that I worked on for the, you know, basically from 2015 to 2020. We all know this fellow, Salt Bay, Turkish butcher and chef and inventor of the $1,000 24-carat tomahawk steak. There's this essay by John Glubb, and it's called The Fate of Empires. And in this essay, Glob writes about the rise and the decay of every society. An interesting moment in, let's say, the starting point for every society to decline is that there's one group of people that becomes famous, let's say what we would now call influencers, and that's chefs. So the minute actually a society does not relate to food as food, but actually as entertainment, that's the kind of like the signal or the beginning of the decline. So I thought it was an interesting kind of insight. But of course, it's also like a good opening image. But what we also like tend to forget then is that it's actually directly linked to a society that maybe ignores issues like climate change, that is rapidly changing, and it also like changes, of course, our modern urban centered life. And of course, around the world, and this was happening in Holland, but this was happening in many other places in the world at the same time. There are societies, let's say across the globe, that are facing the same kind of, fading belief in not only the globalized world, but also like in politics, and maybe the root of that is actually this kind of disconnect between what happens in the city and what happens in the countryside. And in 2007, we saw this, or we took this this statistic from 2007 that for the first time actually in human history, there were more people living in cities than in the countryside. And so it even predicted that by 2050, 70 or 80% of mankind would live in cities. And so that was not only an interesting statistic, but also it became almost like this exclusive alibi for, or an alibi actually for exclusive focus on the city. So planners, mayors, politicians, everyone was so focused on the city because the city was the future. But by doing that, they had neglected the countryside. And what we tried to, let's say, investigate, but also like put together this image that this was not always the case. There was a time, actually, especially in the 20th century, when politics and countryside were very strongly connected. So it was an era of let's say, mega engineering. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and all these leaders, by no coincidence, all men, tried to show that in order to modernize a country, you'd had to kind of modernize or move the countryside. But of course, all of them were oblivious for the kind of like risks that that would come out of this effort. And some really interesting projects, and how crazy they are, or how, let's say, sometimes in terms of like almost like despicable they are in treating the earth. But it shows how, for example, this is a project by Herman Zorgel called Atlantropa, that the only way for Europe to survive was actually to create an alliance with Africa, because only then was it big enough, would it have more like enough space, let's say, for production, for food, for people to live, to compete, let's say, with the Americas or with Asia. And of course, like completely megalomaniac, but it shows this kind of confidence that in some cases architects would have on redesigning the planet, and still have sometimes. So what Zorgel did was he created this kind of system of between like food production, food consumption, infrastructure, and he saw this whole world as one system, as almost like a closed loop that would feed Europe, that would create the space to, let's say, grow and actually also generate energy. And one way to do that was actually to create a large kind of man-made lake from the Mediterranean by blocking, let's say, the entry points and putting dams there to generate energy. So by lowering it with 200 meters, they would create about 600,000 square kilometers of new land. And at the same time, you would actually make the crossings between Europe and Africa much shorter. And of course, this is, you know, very problematic by its starting point, as you literally see Africa kind of offering something to Europe. But at the same time, like if the approach, or let's say a different view than this pure unequal kind of alliance would have taken place, perhaps actually, especially today, where Europe, I think, is only declining, is aging, and the largest population growth in the next decades would be actually in Africa. You could almost imagine like what would happen if this was a more equal kind of alliance. Stalin, let's say, redesigned parts of the Soviet Union by these shelter belts, trees that were planted in kind of like long rows with this kind of like almost like a computer-coded language of different types of trees in order to keep the cold Siberian forests away from or actually protect the agriculture from these kind of cold Siberian winters and winds. And these are still visible from the air today. So, you know, if you would start, and this is by far a kind of complete world map, but if you would start to, let's say, put all these projects together, you see that this 20th century was a century of kind of mega projects, but also, you know, trying to, let's say, force humans' will on nature, but also on the planet for their own benefit. And of course, like this was accelerated in the 50s in different parts of the world. Of course, in China, through a different, let's say, narrative, as in Europe. But also Europe was really struggling with kind of food production right after the war. The trauma of the Second World War, and this is Mansholt, farmer, but also first Minister of Agriculture of Europe. He set out to, let's say, reshape Europe in order to actually produce the amount of food that we would need. And unknown to him, basically, or maybe something that people didn't realize that much, is that had a huge impact on the landscape, especially on the Dutch landscape, where this kind of, you know, mosaic of bits and pieces of land transformed into this large, monotonous, one crop kind of fields that were very efficient for food production. Unfortunately, this plan only worked in, let's say, the flat parts of Europe. So everything blue, it kind of worked. So this kind of like larger scale efficiency and larger scale farms could survive, and everything that was hilly, it wouldn't work. So this was almost like, you know, a kind of a fight between the flat part of Europe and the hilly part of Europe. But Mansholt realized he made a big mistake after reading this book, The Limits of Growth, by the Club of Rome. This was an interesting group of scientists that had a vision, or basically that calculated that, you know, like the future was not unlimited, and there is a definitely limit to the growth of the world, and by, for the first time, kind of introducing computer models, they could pinpoint exactly when this would happen, and when, let's say, the world would run out of food, and catastrophe would happen. an interesting person actually to investigate, or let's say to research in this context, was Forrester, who basically applied a kind of system thinking on nature, and he went as far as actually developing a kind of system for the world where, like, money, but economy, everything you can imagine would fit into this one system, and with this one system you could actually explain but also predict everything. And this was based on a model by Tálasi, who invented the term ecosystem. And for the first time actually in history, we were developing almost like a machine model, a computer model of nature and of the world. Interestingly enough, there were more ecologists that followed and that used this approach to nature as a kind of closed system with feedback loops, to describe nature as a kind of stable and consistent environment, and that humans are part of it, but as long as we would, gather enough data, we would be able to kind of predict where things would go wrong and where we would be able to kind of adjust it. Unfortunately, this was adopted by a completely different group of people, so not ecologists, but actually economists, who thought that the idea of, let's say, applying this kind of model, this computer model, to predict, let's say, societies, was best to use in economy. And so while Mansholt kind of retired, a new school of thinkers, let's say, started to predict what they thought was the ideal world. And of course, it's no coincidence that, let's say, this system and thinking of nature as a system leaves traces in nature, but also in the way that we talk about nature, or even about food. How am I doing in time? Good. Yeah. And so farms start to mirror, let's say, this kind of programming, chasing this kind of myth of perpetual growth. And like with Mansholt's kind of intervention, the diversity of farmland and type of farms and type of produce was rapidly kind of minimized. And it's also no surprise that this language or this approach would then also be embraced by people who have embraced computer or computer thinking or machine thinking from Silicon Valley. And of course, we also looked at the effect of it and how does something as simple as the cow landscape in the world has changed, and we see that this kind of diversity of cows starts to shrink, and that there's this one type of cow that is found basically everywhere in the world, which is the Holstein Friesian cow. And in some cases even live indoor in this kind of refrigerated stables and indoor nature, a kind of indoor countryside. A non-resilient, let's say, clean nature, only approached in clean suits with clean room apparel. And of course it's a huge a jump from this image 100 years ago. And this is not to kind of be nostalgic about it, but it's much more to show like what this systematic thinking or machine thinking almost has kind of accomplished. Diversity in many cases is changed. And a very interesting coincidence, while we were doing our research on the Westland, we came across that Descartes had lived in Holland and actually in the Westland area, which is one of the largest greenhouse areas in the world. And the Dutch are very proud of that because that makes them kind of like the #2 producer of food in the world. They don't tell you that they also produce a lot of tulips in that equation. So But the interesting thing about this idea was that Descartes developed some of his thinking in Holland specifically, where he basically placed mankind outside of nature and in a certain sense actually above nature, where already the traces of this idea of like nature being a machine that can be adjusted or played with almost like for our entertainment was starting to take shape. So in some cases gardens were filled with fake birds that would sing, working on kind of like hydraulics. And of course then, and maybe it's a big jump, but it's not a big jump if you start to see like our ability to start, let's say, distancing almost ourselves from nature in a certain way, where then, animals start to become, objects or products. And all with this idea of like, if you have this X and Y axis, you can kind of project that on anything to, let's say, decipher its movement or position. Of course, applied in the Dutch countryside, again another big pride of the country, and of course it led to a kind of certain group of people that of course applied that same kind of approach maybe to maybe even other planets. But as a result, let's say even like our wild lands are becoming kind of like ideal flatlands and ideal currency for energy, for example, for cattle and food. And in some cases, this weird kind of combination between data centers on the left and greenhouses on the right. But what we kind of found interesting to observe is that, where the countryside, or where cities were actually struggling with this type of scale, of course the countryside could imagine this kind of future on a large scale. We visited the Tahoe Reno Industrial Park, where there is a form of architecture, a kind of abstracted architecture, almost like as a back office to the internet, to our fulfillment centers, data centers, that produce this weird kind of abstracted, geometric, almost like Cartesian type of architecture that we again find in the Westland, almost mimicking it one-to-one. And so here, inside those greenhouses, the food is kind of neatly manicured, only touched with gloves, in very stable kind of conditions, in what we maybe would call unnatural, but in the opinion of the greenhouse CEOs, this is the most organic you can get. There is no pesticides, there's no bugs, there's the cleanest water, and everything with a touch of a button. And so this fascination of, I think, a mechanized nature or a mechanized kind of world, and even our food, is something that maybe is haunting us for a very long time. Another region we looked at was the 281 route in 281 route in the US, where you could actually see what the scale of mega farms does, also to nature, where there's no birds, basically no insects almost anymore, because everything is such an efficient kind of monoculture. Which is an incredibly unnatural thing to do, because there is no form of nature that is so uniform. But it shows also like how, let's say, not only the landscape, but maybe even our language in a way is kind of like becoming more uniform, and maybe even more a kind of like machine language or manager's language. And this is what a farmer used to do in the 1700s, and this is what a farmer does today behind his laptop, reading images, sent by these angels. Let me see how many slides I still have. A lot, but maybe I should just I should keep it here. Well, maybe there's a
45 minutes.
45. Okay, then. Well, let me then just go to this last couple of slides where we just again like collected ideas from the countryside. You know, where there is this question, you know, like nature is over. There's a kind of inevitability of urbanization. We will all be urban, but you could still also like question the other way around. Maybe a rediscovery of countryside is necessary. And so these were all the spots that we visited. And this is interesting maybe to show recently where, and I think a lot of it actually, what is happening here is now kind of like getting together. So you have a social media account of a troll that speaks about a teenage, let's say, activist, because let's say the kind of political elite is not present, and the first thing they do is basically say that this is a staged kind of protest because she's posing with these two officers. And I think that we all just like look at this image and we kind of accept it for what it is. But there's of course like in that, again maybe in this juxtaposition, a lot of things that are wrong. You know, like we don't take politicians anymore serious. We tend to like these kind of like fake news kind of responses to something that maybe is still a form of idealism. And so what we looked at, and I think what we will look at, because we are developing a kind of part 2 for the show in 2025, where we, I think in a way, also have to focus on different approaches to nature, to food, maybe also non-Western, also maybe non-male. Where we also think of maybe different models of settlement. So neither city nor village, but like an old model that Fourier once developed, the phalanstery. And maybe we even should take seasteading serious, a kind of like libertarian answer to, well, basically jumping ship and retreating to sea, refuting any form of government and relying on the kind of balancing power of money and computers to create this kind of ideal society. And maybe we need actually more machines and more robots to keep some parts of the Japanese countryside alive. Or maybe agriculture should be completely done by robots, because actually robots are more humane than people. And are able to, let's say, observe, intervene, and preserve even more precisely. And maybe you should give these guys a chance in Wageningen that are trying to, let's say, develop plants where they increase photosynthesis with 50%, something that took nature, I think, 2.3 million years. But this is a kind of test bed room where plants are subdued to kind of like light or cold or heat, and every little leaf is measured in terms of output, almost as a form of, you know, like, and of course all of that is stored, remodeled in a kind of like a metaverse of plants. But at the same time, in Wageningen, one group is trying or experimenting with a different type of agriculture, where instead of these kind of like monocrops, these kind of pixel crops are studied, so that maybe agricultural fields would look like this in the future. Some things that the Mayans had already discovered and worked with. And interestingly, recently there's more and more research about, for example, the Amazon, one of our pristine kind of images of nature, that this wasn't so pristine at all. And it was managed and planted by humans for centuries. Other experiments like reanimating maybe empty parts of Europe with new people to actually not only keep the countryside alive, or not only from a kind of like production point of view, but actually also from a cultural point of view, where traditions and ceremonies are kind of injected with new ideas, creating a kind of countryside in flux rather than one that is emptying. An experiment in China where, let's say, authentic countryside is rebuilt and remodeled and rebranded, while at the same time using the most advanced form of countryside where you as a consumer can buy directly from the farmer. Or the experiment in Africa where certain ideas to actually move away from the mega cities, but actually to have a kind of a finer network of villages because of internet and because you don't need the city anymore. You don't need certain things like banks, or because everything can go through your mobile. That could also help to, let's say, repopulate or repopulate the countryside. I'll just go to the exhibition. I don't know who of you saw the exhibition, who was able to go to New York. It's actually like 3 weeks after the show opened, it got closed because of Corona. Which was a pity, because then it opened again in like July, then it closed again, opened up in September again, and then stayed until February the next year. But this is what it looked like. This was the kind of unswept floor, like a Roman concept we applied to the rotunda floor, with all the, let's say, the new actors and the new people that or objects that we found in the countryside. A kind of opening text on the bottom side of the ramps. And then as you would kind of like walk up these ramps, we would start with the idea of like, what happened basically in 100 years, how we went from this to that. A room of questions with some of the research production. Sorry. On this ramp, we looked at how this idea of free time was always developed and developed in the countryside, and that if you would trace it back, the Romans and ancient China already had this idea or concept about what to do and how to live in the countryside and spend your free time in the countryside, and that slowly maybe kind of changed to wellness and yoga. This is the level of political redesign, where we used archive material from films, documentaries, but also, together with like the research, and we basically collaged everything together. So every bay, as you see here, this is Russia, this is China, this is Holland, and this is Qatar. This is the floor of experiments, so a collection of all kinds of experiments on, new models of society, let's say, in the countryside, all the way up to nature, and then the final floor was Cartesian, where we had a working machine, the Finnovator. That's it.
Thank you so much, Samir. It was impressive, I guess, for all of you. We started with a luxury car and then went into from Prada to Virgil, and now a cultural history of the countryside that ends now this massive exhibition. And a beautiful overview also of the spectrum of work that you deal with, no? And maybe I start with the first question and you guys can prepare, but I'm obviously very interested, I mean, in a lot of things, but in many ways you act as a translator. You're a trained architect, but you have to kind of figure out how to express a design or an artist, whether it's Prada or the luxury car or it's Virgil, or it's a topic or a content into like a spatial figuration in one way or another. And there goes so much work into it, no? Like the last 20 minutes of kind of your, and these were just glimpses of the research that you've done to come up with this exhibition. I'd be really curious to learn a little bit more on really the process of making it, what your methodology is here, and also what of this methodology is from your architecture background.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think the methodology, and I think maybe what drew me to AMO was that the methodology was actually something different that than I had learned from architecture school, which basically says like you have a brief, you translate the brief to spaces, you find materials, construction, etc., and then you basically create this space. And what AMO represented for me was actually a much more kind of journalistic approach, where you would investigate a topic, and sometimes that topic could be your client, and try to find that thing that matters most to you, like what you think is most important from this kind of investigation. And in some cases that actually helps you to kind of redefine the brief, or make the brief more specific rather than generic, you know, because one could say like I need a car dealership, but if you then turn back and say, well, do you need a car dealership or do you need a place where people can actually enjoy, you know, a kind of selection of cars, so not all 50 cars but maybe only 10 cars, where you could actually indulge yourself in what this brand is about. And so, you know, and that's a very maybe kind of almost like the most superficial way to approach, where here we didn't even have, let's say, a starting point. The only thing that we knew was this kind of statistic that there are these changes in let's say, city life versus countryside life. And that even to our knowledge, like, you know, we were quite ignorant as well. Like what were these things that we were not engaged in as architects? And so those are the questions you actually ask. There is not even a brief. There's just like this wish to investigate it more and to understand it more. And that basically is collected into, let's say, topics where there's like tons of research from like libraries to just basically desktop research, and that actually then slowly becomes your narrative or your idea. But there's no, I mean, there's definitely this is not scientific. It's not kind of academic in that sense. But we try not to be too opinionated. Say like, you know, we think it should be this or we think it should be that. And again, also like this was a topic that was, I think, not meant to be completely kind of research, because I think that's impossible. But we would take out what we thought was interesting from this 5 years of research, and it's by far complete.
Yeah, but I think and my last follow-up, and then it's you guys, yeah. But the incompleteness you stressed also when you talked about the prototypes that Virgil Abloh did. Yeah. I think that's also the power of it. And maybe about methodology, it's very obvious, but basically in all the projects that you showed, collage is the recurrent theme. I'm very interested in that way of working as a method, or as probably the most dominant way of cultural production today. Yeah. But why for you guys? Why did you choose collage as one of your key approaches?
Well, I think in a way, like it helps you to kind of like get a message out very precisely. But at the same time, I think, I mean, when we started talking with the Guggenheim about the show, the first thing they said, like, you know, way too much images, like way too many images, way too much text, like people won't read this, and this is too content heavy. people stand in front of an art piece for 13 seconds. So this will, you know, like no one will read this. But then when we pushed for it because we felt that actually, you know, that's also like a missed opportunity. Why should a museum only be about like one single image? Why shouldn't it be, you know, much more of this kind of research in this sense? And this was the first time actually in the Guggenheim that they would not dedicate it to an art show, but actually
to a theme,
to a research or investigation. And we found out that people actually came back 2 times, 3 times to read everything, and they would spend much more time. And some people actually, you know, like kept notes and sent us like, you're wrong here, like this is not correct, and you know. But that I think is also a part of it. Like you have to be open to that kind of like level of imprecision as well.
Nice. So with this said, I would like to open now to you guys. First question already here. Yeah. And speak up as loud as you can. So.
Okay. I want to say thank you so much for the presentation. My question is, as a person who has worked with Virgil before, you know, you talked about how many different principles he uses. I want to know what type of media would he consume the most and draw inspiration from, and what his process was like.
That's a good one. I mean, media. Well, like the one form of communication that we had was basically WhatsApp, and so everything happened on WhatsApp. So that was also like a first time for me, because I used to do everything like through email. Like you'd have like a record and everything. Like you would have everything collected, but I soon found out like, you know, like email is so slow in that sense. Like you have a list, but for some kind of reason, I don't know like what happens in your brain, but you cannot go through all the things. But for WhatsApp, it was much easier to kind of like directly answer things. And so whether it was decks or whether it was sketches or sometimes even like, you know, pictures of something I saw or he saw outside, we take a picture and scribble some notes on top of it. That was basically the way of communicating, the fastest. And so there wasn't one particular, let's say, type of medium. But the tool was WhatsApp.
And there's another question here and the one in the back row. Yeah. And again, as loud as possible. Could you hear the other question, guys? Yeah, no? Yeah.
Yes, so thank you also. But my question is why, especially in this exhibition, it's not important to have an opinion, or because it's like a very translation of different ways that exist, how nature is perceived from, I don't know, 100 years ago to today. So people get them interested for maybe, or have a bigger picture of it. Also very, I mean, it's insane, it's huge. But why for you or your team it is not important to show an opinion or like a...
Well, I mean, you know, not to show an opinion, maybe that's an overstatement. I think the point is not to tell you you should think this or you should think that. The point was, this is what we investigated, and there's a lot of interesting ideas and topics that basically this was kind of like showing our ignorance, like all these things we didn't know of, and I think there's like, if you would walk through this like as a professor in European history, you would find so many things that are still missing. But the trick was actually to get enough information together on each topic to start even thinking about like this countryside, this image that we have of this countryside, which is basically, again, like nostalgia. It's like, you know, the farmer, it's pristine nature and everything. First of all, that image is not correct. And by showing this kind of variety, and also like how all these forms of thinking about the countryside have, in a way, maybe trapped us in thinking about the countryside only in a form of nostalgia. Maybe that's a kind of idea, but it's not so much like an opinion, like this is my opinion and there's... Because like an opinion, I think, is also always difficult, because if it's my opinion, then you can either agree or disagree. But if I show you basically what we looked at and we discovered, then that I think is a more interesting basis for you to talk about it, or to, let's say, to talk about it together.
Or to make your opinion. Question in the very back row, and then Hassan here. And really loud, please.
Okay. So, like, there's a lot to unwrap. I actually don't know where to begin, but you, for example, you have this one slide with the totalitarian leaders of Europe beginning of the 20th century, and like these ludicrous large landscaping plans. And I mean, I'm sure you're aware that these people brought great fame regardless, like even if you exclude the war, and that this never happened, and that they ruined like their country. And then you draw the line from there over to like these plans that I don't know how like everyone else feels about this, but to me they have like clear like right libertarian connotations, and like maybe you can clarify, but to me you did not contextualize this in like a critical manner, or like in what context you see this and then what you draw from this, and this continue throughout with some like techno-libertarian ideas. Like it's like a lot to unwrap. I'm not going to go into these. I'm happy to engage in like a conversation in detail, but I want to say like I think there are like a couple of very problematic ideas. Maybe where there was.
Well, there are many problematic ideas, but I don't think that it's up to us to let's say not talk about problematic ideas. I think problematic ideas exist because we have to talk about them, and we have to, say that we don't agree with this idea of that, like if Europe and Africa would, let's say, be combined, then Africa serves Europe, which in reality is still happening, right? I mean, like all of our phones, all of our laptops run on stuff that is found in Africa. And without Africa, like our modern society would not be able to work. But if I would start, like, let's say the exhibition in that way, then I think it's again, then we're talking much more about like an opinionated exhibition, where I think it's up to you to actually form your own opinion about it. I'm definitely not pro seasteading or like the libertarian form of society. But we should talk about it, and we should explain why this is a good idea or whether it's a really bad idea.
I mean, like most of these concepts are either like pseudoscience or they are already debunked. Like even like I agree, absolutely. Let's talk about this. But what I was missing in your talk today was some contextualization of this.
Oh, okay. Then I would need another hour.
Maybe we can also jump to the next one, and we can pick this conversation up after the talk. If you work with the principle of collage, and you at the same time, which I very much do too, there's always this level of completeness, and there's always, as you called it, juxtaposition, as this lecture here is called juxtaposition. You will not get into the nitty-gritty. You might have the pseudoscience next to the academic one, but that's the power of working with the method of collage. No, what you're looking at is not only in the imagery, but also in the follow-up of content is also a form of collage. Yeah. So you have to kind of understand the method that we're working with here. And then it gets a bit tricky with this argument. But Hassan.
Yeah, I just had a question.
And loud again so the background
understands. Okay. About a couple of slides that you had from the countryside at the end, there was this thing called M-Pesa in Kenya, I think. This black bank system, or like, that kind of gave them a little bit of, especially young people, like a little bit of like liberation, because they could move like more independent through that. And it kind of plays into the analogy of like companies, or like, I don't know, even though they're like profit driven, that they can be kind of, or move faster than like governments or nations in some sort of ways. So I just wanted to know what you think about the analogy at all, and like if you have more examples from the countryside where you thought that it could be kind of be useful, even though companies are still, of course, profit-driven. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think one of the lines within the whole exhibition, and maybe also like to come back to you again, I think is that, as you said correctly, I think companies are taking more over basically parts that that used to be driven by politics. And whether it's like national politics or whether it's like local politics, we saw that also like some parts of I mean, if you look at farming, for example, it's completely commercial, where there is no politics basically involved. It's the market that should regulate itself, and I think that has been happening, of course, like since the 80s, where the market said, like, we have this machine that we call computer, and it's actually objective. It's able to kind of like stabilize things. We just need the data to actually feed it, and then we'll tell you what comes out of it, and that's how you basically regulate the country. And that, I think, is something that we have maybe, how do you say, we've submitted ourselves to that. And I think you'll see that everywhere. And even this M-Pesa, I think, yes, it's an advantage for people in villages that don't have to travel now to, let's say, the nearest town for a couple of hours in either by shitty road or whatever, but they could actually do the banking by mobile. But again, that also again creates this kind of distance between politics and your direct environment. So yeah, it's very hard to say like whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think that there's definitely bad things that could come out of it, because if there's a complete disconnect from politics, that's, I think, also like a way that we're completely disconnected, let's say, from the countryside or from nature, or how we perceive nature in a way.
Yes, Andres?
I think there was someone before me.
What's that?
I think there was someone before me, though.
Well, you're the lucky one now.
Okay. I wanted to ask particularly about, you talk about how an architect can think about these topics with the architectural point of view. And I found it very interesting, like where's the limit, or what does define architectural thinking in your opinion? Like, where is the key points where you say, okay, maybe not the limit, but maybe a starting point where you say, okay, this is how an architect would kind of think about this. And then the other, connected to this maybe, or maybe not, is how does AMO work with OMA, or in which points are there collaborations and connections in your experience?
Yeah. I mean, for the first question, I think the whole point is actually not to limit yourself, because that was, the reason why AMO in a way was kind of set up. Because architecture is in a way kind of a limit, because you have like stones and bricks, and there's hardware to build, and there's a program, and there's a client and everything. But if you take that away and you apply the same kind of methodology of like, investigating the client or your brief or whatever to things that are not, let's say, within your typical kind of range, then it's, and it's not to, not as a form of arrogance, but actually just as a form of curiosity. Like if you're curious to know about this, and in some cases people ask you specifically because you're not an expert in something. Like for example, if I would just look at the stores, experts in retail, for example, would basically disagree with every single project that I did, literally, and they did, because the square meter price was not working, the return on investment was not working, blah blah blah. But there's a lot of components, again, that are not in that equation of let's say retail experts. That you can bring in, that could be culture, or that could be subculture, or that could be, So I think there's always a kind of level of being or remaining an amateur, let's say, in a certain field, because that also makes you want to understand more. Again, also like with the exhibition, I think this was 5 years of our work, where we literally went from like all kinds of topics, and there's so many topics that actually we didn't kind of follow through, just because simply there's just no time to kind of do it. But starting with a kind of fresh eye within these topics actually helps you to actually maybe be more creative or more original than, let's say, if you would ask a University of Agriculture to do an historic perspective on Europe and agriculture. You would get a completely different exhibition.
And regarding the AMO, OMA?
Yeah, regarding AMO, OMA, I mean, I think there's myth that AMO is this, separate floor with separate like team or whatever. I think it's one firm, and we have a number of AMO projects we're running at the same time. So you could be working on an OMA project at one time and then switch to an AMO project. So there is no kind of like clear distinction there. And I think that's also like a way to, even within architectural teams, to have a certain critical point of view, but also like to have maybe a connection to some kind of topic that we looked at, researched, or investigated.
There was here, no, yes, please, and loud and clear.
Yes. First of all, thanks again for your presentation. It was really great. You kind of illustrated what's happening in my brain on a daily basis, and it's good to see that some other people think like this from time to time. You mentioned two things since this Q&A started. The first one is that when you first presented this exhibition to the Guggenheim, they said that there were too many images and too much text. The second thing is that when you said that when you were communicating with Virgil, you were using WhatsApp because email was just not it. It was too cluttered and you couldn't process the list. This made me think about our decreasing, like people decreasing attention span. And I was wondering how in your work, if you were faced with this, I want to say issue, but I'm not sure if it's an issue, it's the thing that happens. So to this thing. So do you sometimes manage to communicate what you want to communicate, be it in an exhibition, an architecture project, or a fashion project? Is this something that you're facing and that you have to adapt to, this decreasing attention span?
I mean, it's something that we always hear, and that actually was also like one of the reasons why the Guggenheim told us not to use that many images and text, because they were saying like, people don't have the attention span to do this. And we've proven them wrong. I think there are people who still like to read things and who like to stay, in a museum for a couple of hours rather than 20 minutes. And in some cases, apparently also it came back. The same thing happened a bit like, although there was much less text, with the Making Doha exhibition, where we had quite a lot of content, and to some extent also like stuff that was interesting maybe for bureaucrats to know, like which department worked with which architect under which ruler or whatever. But in the end, that's actually when people tell us that they like that much more than the kind of like simplified or dumbed down version, because then maybe again to come back to the idea of an opinion, then I'm limiting or I'm editing something down to what I think you are able to understand. We're not doing that. We're giving you the full thing. And if you want to read for 5 hours, you can do that. If you want to do it like in 20 minutes, you can do that. But we don't, I mean, like one way of producing is still books. I mean, the booklet, like the catalog for the show, was another kind of form. Like, we won't do just an exhibition, we'll also do a booklet. And that booklet will be, again, like a collection of stories and ideas, and because we still think that people actually do read and can take interest in subjects.
And are you using this? I remember in beginning, there's this essay where he mentions this Aaron video, and the interviewer juxtaposes it to Kierkegaard's view of indirect communication, where Kierkegaard says that the only way to communicate the truth is through emotions, not through logical discourse. And is this something that you're using sometimes in your work to, at least to grab the attention of people through an emotional, let's say, I don't want to say trick, but like hook, you know, and then show them all that text that you mentioned?
Well, there is definitely a form of, let's say, composition, you know, like, and there is definitely a message. There's also, like, of course, an idea why we would select a certain image and combine it with another image. And that is indeed because of that reason, because you not only want to convey a certain idea or a range of ideas, but you also want to do that in a way that people can kind of either remember or, you know, become curious about it. Like, you know, what is this image? Who is this guy? And who is this person? And so, yeah, I think, but I mean, like, it's not that we're like, oh, no, this is a dull image, let's throw in something spectacular. I think we often actually go for very dull images. But together they form, I think, something emotional in a way.
But maybe I can follow up to this one, because this makes me think of accessibility. Remember, we talked about this quite often also before, like well, these are all forms of cultural production that we've seen here, but how do you make it accessible? Two things. First, the quote from the Virgil Abloh exhibition, "You're obviously in the wrong place," from Pretty Woman. It speaks about who has access, who doesn't have access. How can you make a rather complex topic accessible? And then I remember actually from an interview that I saw with you about this exhibition, you were differentiating in the way you make exhibition between the tourist and the purist. And could you elaborate on this notion again? I think that's quite helpful. And generally speaking, on the notion of accessibility, what that means also for your practice and you working in the field of architecture.
Yeah,
which is still a very elite discipline.
Yeah. Well, I think this idea of tourist versus purist came out of the MCA show we did, Virgil and I did, because also there I think a lot of people actually didn't know who he was, and especially that the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago would spend a full floor dedicated to this young guy who is not even an artist, was something that people questioned. You know, like, is he relevant enough to have a show at the MCA? And that again, like, showed, you know, where, you know, in some cases, sometimes the art world or museum world can be quite elitist and maybe also like for the purist, while in some cases, you know, what we tended to do was we turned it around. We made this purist, this kind of like elitist museum goer who frequently goes and knows all the artists, suddenly becomes a tourist because he doesn't know anything about this person. He doesn't know his production. He doesn't know his world. But there's something for him to explore. And then suddenly this 16-year-old kid coming to a museum knows every piece that was in the museum. And so that was, you know, like a kind of flip that we used, especially for the MCA. And again, turned out to be interesting because then there was suddenly this kind of place where these both worlds would meet. And also, like, the MCA told us that this is the first time that we had so many young people line up for a show. So yeah, that's the idea of the tourist and the purist. And I think, I mean, in architecture itself, that, you know, throughout my own studies, I always read about, let's say, the big names, and this was basically one set of, this was one typology. It was a white, kind of older male who had ideas and who wrote theories or who built buildings, and that was the architect. That was the prototype architect. And at the same time, that was exactly also like the reason why I went into architecture. Like, you know, there's maybe something there to change, or something to maybe reposition in a way, or recalibrate. There is much more cultural production than maybe the architect, the purist, would know about.
Mm. Okay, this was my in-between. Question from you guys, another one? Yes, please.
Thank you.
Nice, okay.
First of all, thank you. I have one question, and I hope I can formulate it. It has to do with precision. As like the first projects that you showed, which are more architectonic, and also the first in the beginning, had to do a lot with precise working or precise determination of spatial arrangements and so on. And ongoing in this lecture, everything became less precise, and which I don't think is bad. But I want to know if it was had just to do with the thing that we were starting to look through at this topics through a macro lens, or it's a decision that you took that perhaps lack of this precision would be helpful in order to investigate these topics.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think what seems as a lack of precision was actually a very precise form of editing, because of course, like, you know, we had you know, many like ideas, topics, things that we like. For every topic, we would literally make a book like this thick of like material, like a reader basically. And from that, we would basically edit it down to what we in the end show. And also there, like, you know, certain image would work, certain images wouldn't work. So there is a precision in that. If you would say completeness, then yes, that's correct. There is no completeness in it, because this is, you know, again, seen through our lens. So I don't think that precision is the right word, because it's maybe decision. Like, you decide what you want to show, and you decide also like what you don't want to show, which is also in the way how you work in architecture. Like, you decide, you know, how things reach or how things collide. But that always looks maybe more precise, because it's, you know, it's easier to comprehend. I don't know. I think it's the medium, maybe. Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of both in what you say, I think.
And
I don't mind this as a like bad thing.
No. Me neither. No. And I agree. That's why I say, like, I think you're right in the terms of, like, you know, there's a decisive or precise way of unprecision, like being not precise.
I would like to follow up with another question that's also with you guys in mind. I briefly told you that it's a very mixed bag here of students, but they do group works, team works, very mixed clusters. So let's talk about collaboration for a second. You mentioned the WhatsApp conversation with Virgil Abloh. You obviously have to work closely with Rem Koolhaas and many different clients, from the Guggenheim to the car retailer, or I don't know what. Could you elaborate on your biggest learnings and collaborations, the do's and don'ts, or how different this can be also from each collaborating partner or partners that you have?
Yeah, that's another tough question. I think, you know, like what I've learned is that you shouldn't, let's say, portray yourself as a certain typology, let's say. So, you know, for example, like when you study architecture, like you start to see people kind of like, you know, the more and more they get closer to graduation, talk like architects, speak like, you know, walk like architects, dress like architects, you know, which is typical and which is fine. But then talking with your client, that also like becomes almost like a very generic type of conversation. So, and what I actually learned from working with all these different people was, you know, that there is a way to kind of, you know, I was born in Morocco and I grew up in Holland, so that meant I always had to kind of like almost choose which identity I would show. You know, do I speak to you as a Dutch person, or do I speak to you as the immigrant kid, or do I speak to you as a Moroccan, or do I speak to you as... So there was an ability actually to kind of like switch between these identities without faking the identity. And I think that enables you to read your client better and understand your client better, because it's not that you're trying to tell him what your client wants to hear, but you're doing it actually from a, I don't know, like you become much more of a kind of like a mirror to that person, but you're able to understand that person because you're able to kind of like switch between those different forms of communication. And I'm 100% sure that I communicate differently with my Korean client as, let's say, maybe a very traditional Dutch architect would do. You know, so that I think that there's a nuance that you're able to kind of learn by being in different environments and unknown environments.
It's also, do you realize how many recurring themes we are starting to have? No, like that our, with the speakers that we have here, the different backdrops that we all have, the different situated knowledges that we bring into the game. You just mentioned you were born in Morocco, you grew up in Dutch, you have these different identities you can choose from, but they can be, we had this discussion often that in one point in their life they were very pressuring, and in one point, I think for most of the people that spoke here, they were very liberating, and they were more like superpowers eventually. So that kind of combines a few topics.
Well, I mean, like as another example, I would never have had the type of collaboration with Virgil if I mean, like literally, like the first 3-4 sentences we spoke to each other, it was as if I was meeting a kind of university friend. Mm-hmm. You know, like we had the same interests. We understood exactly immediately what he meant, even if he would use, let's say, almost his kind of you know, like Chicago kind of slang. Not Chicago slang, but you know. But at the same time, we would also be able to switch to kind of like intellectual topics, you know, because of course, like we were taught in school, like, you know, to be intellectuals. So there was this kind of switch that also even in our conversation would happen a lot. Like we would go from I mean, like a hip hop song to a talk by Rem and Hans-Ulrich Hobeist, for example. Yeah, I think again, like the ability to be able to feel comfortable in all these different environments is, yeah, what you could call a superpower, maybe.
In the form of a collage again, by the way.
Yeah.
Another question from you, otherwise I come to the final 2 questions. Yes, but there's another one.
Short question. What has helped you gathering the courage to approach architecture in such not to like withstand the conservative approach to architecture? Was it rather like also a trial and error approach for you? I mean, talking about failure, we often don't get to see the failed approaches. So were you always like really courageous, or did you also have a lot of like moments of despair in your career?
I think there's not a single person, not a single architect who doesn't feel despair or doubt in his career. If that doesn't happen, then you're a machine, I think. But no, I think like for almost like every project, there is a moment where you're doubting like what you're doing. In the smaller scheme, but also to a very large scheme. But I think at the same time, like to, you know, use that doubt as a form of like, okay, well, you know, or to rethink it almost like as a form of curiosity, because like you're doubtful because you don't know something, and what is it that I don't know, and how can I understand what I need to know in order to maybe feel more comfortable and confident about that. yeah, and I guess that's, you know, a very personal thing, and I think that that differs from every person. But I think it's actually also like a good feeling or a nice feeling to sometimes feel that you don't know, but you still have to do it, and you still have to finish the project, or you still have to present to your client, even though you don't know. And that's not the. I mean, I think the imposter syndrome is something else. I think it's you know, knowing that you don't know, but here it's like, you know, there's something that you're like, I don't know yet. I haven't discovered it yet.
Okay, I could go on, however. Okay, only two last ones. You mentioned now in the conversations, you talked about a hip-hop song, then the last talk by Rem. So I'm curious, like, what inspires you, or other way, what inspired you in the first place to enter the field of architecture, and what inspires you still today to do what you're doing? Because I think sometimes it's much more interesting to hear people talk about the inspiration, the influences, rather than the final work.
Yeah. Well, I think I was actually, I had an art class, and I had art as a how do you say, like we
minor.
As a minor, yeah. No, as a major actually in high school, and this was one of the first years that you could actually have art as a major. And so I took it because I was good at drawing. And so my art teacher said, like, you have to study art, like you have to go to an art school. And I'm like, dude, like my father and mother, they came all the way from Morocco for me to come, like, become an artist. And like, what do I tell them? Like, I have no idea where I would work. I have no idea how much money I would make. I have no idea. So basically I'm choosing insecurity. And he's like, yeah, you know, because that's the courageous thing to do. Like, you know, you have to believe in your talent, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, no, for you, but not for me. So, but during art class, we were studying, let's say, like techniques that artists use, like painters, but also sculptors and architects of grandiosity. You know, like, how do you explain that? And how do you visualize that? And so there was this one picture actually in that book that there was like this spread, and it was the construction site of the Arc de la Défense in Paris. Mm-hmm. And it was still kind of like at ground level, so you could only see, you know, like all the construction basically going up, the steel frames. And between this kind of like incredibly orchestrated kind of like material or matter were like a number of really small figures just walking around. I'm like, wait, that's interesting, because like one page before this just started out as literally a square. And so like you would flip a page, and then this square so it is a drawing becomes this building, and it becomes a building where people go to, where people, you know, take pictures of, where so suddenly I saw this kind of like power of basically what a drawing, in this sense, art, could actually also become. And architecture was interesting in the sense that it was engineering, it was art, it was so many other things than basically doing something all by yourself. This was something that you had to do with like an enormous group of people also, like much more as a collective. So there were many reasons for me to then decide, like, okay, well, maybe I should check this out. I went to Delft University, and all my other friends like went to Amsterdam and Utrecht, like really cool and nice student cities, and Delft was like, you know, dead. But you know, I thought like maybe that's what I need in order to kind of focus on my studies, and it turned out to be a great choice, because I would be able to kind of like study for every project or every subject. I would study something else, like whether it's, you know, how does a hospital work, like what's the organization of a hospital, or like what's a library, or what's like you'd become a temporary expert in all these different fields.
Beautiful. I'm closing now with the question that you all know. Again, mixed pickles here in the room. It's always difficult, but since many of them have just started, many of them are about to leave the school, what kind of advices could you give that would have helped you maybe when you started?
Don't take any advice.
I kind of expected that answer, but maybe kind of let it sink for a moment and really think, because there is quite a few advice that would have been helpful.
I don't know. I mean, if I would have taken every single advice, I would not be here. Like, I would definitely not go study architecture. I would definitely not. I mean, there were like so many things that people advised me not to do, and you know, like, yeah, why not? So take maybe the opposite of advice. I don't know. Yeah.
No, fair enough. Then our last word of the day is take no advice. And with that, a warm applause and thank you to Samir. Thank you.